The NBA bubble is one of the most polarizing topics of basketball discussion. Ever since the idea was first brought up when everything was shut down, there has been a stubborn group of people who refuse to acknowledge it as real basketball, saying it holds no real legitimacy in their eyes. If you ask me, not only do I think this argument is completely wrong, but I think that the bubble was actually some of the best basketball that we've seen in quite some time. So today, we're going to dispel the arguments that bubble naysayers often use, and then look back and properly celebrate some of the amazing moments that this underrated experience gave us. The first argument that people usually make when trying to deter the bubble is that the change in the day-to-day conditions that players had were too unrealistic compared to the grind of a regular NBA season. Over the course of a typical season in playoffs, players have to deal with an extremely strenuous travel schedule, hostile crowds, and other outside distractions that cause a great amount of wear on the player's psyche. And without these factors, people saw that as a negative and said that it somehow took away from the basketball experience due to things being too easy for the players in this environment. I never understood this argument for a couple of reasons. First of all, yes, it certainly is different not having to deal with these conditions, but it undoubtedly made for a better product on the court. You're telling me that because players don't have to deal with constantly traveling and we're on even playing grounds for every game that somehow the basketball we were watching was worse? That makes zero sense to me. If you miss the crowd aspect, that's one thing. But the overall reduction of outside variables simplified things and made it strictly about who was the better team, which is something I think was awesome to watch. I would much rather one team beat another because they simply outplayed their opponent, not because one team's flight was delayed and they were running on 4 hours of sleep. These conditions also likely resulted in my next point that nobody talks about when it comes to the bubble, the boosted health aspect. The bubble environment helped produce one of the healthiest overall playoff runs in recent memory. When looking back at each of the last 5 postseasons or so, you can point to a major injury that took a contender right out of the picture. Chris Middleton this past season, Kyrie and Harden in 2021, Kevin Durant in 2019, Chris Paul in 2018, Kawhi Leonard in 2017, you get the picture. But the one year where no star player dealt with a major injury was the 2020 bubble. Since they had so much more spare time to treat their bodies and focus on recovery, all of the stars that we wanted to see in big games were available to play. Now, there definitely were guys who dealt with injuries throughout the bubble, though. Gordon Hayward dealt with an ankle injury that hobbled him against the Heat. Ben Simmons missed the entire first-round series against the Celtics with a patella injury, and Russell Westbrook was limited due to quad issues. But none of these injuries were necessarily series-altering. When talking about legitimacy, it makes no sense that the only playoff run in recent memory that wasn't majorly impacted by injuries is the one that people claim to be fraudulent. The other main argument that people love to make when trying to discredit the bubble is that the incredible individual performances that we saw were merely products of the bubble and never would have happened under regular circumstances, which is once again flat out not true. And to quickly get this out of the way, I know it's a meme to say LeMickey and A Disney, but the Lakers were the best team in the league that season. They were the 1 seed out west, had an incredible team defense, and just took down the Clippers and the Bucks in back-to-back games right before the league was suspended. So it's hard to seriously argue that their run was fraudulent without seriously trolling. In terms of individual performances that seem too good to be true, 2 players usually come to mind. The first is TJ Warren, as people say he basically became the second coming of Michael Jordan once he stepped foot in that bubble. And yes, he did play out of his mind during the first 3 games, averaging nearly 40 points on 65% shooting, but he quickly came back down to earth. After this brief outburst, he finished out the remaining regular season games averaging about 22 points a game. And when it was time for the playoffs, he was back to his regular self, putting up 20 points a game en route to getting swept by the Heat. Compare that to his overall average of 19.8 points per game during the 2020 season, and you can see that he was pretty much exactly where he was supposed to be. While his initial stretch was without a doubt insane to watch, it's been glamorized in hindsight, as he for sure regressed back to the mean. The next player that usually gets hated on for their great run in the bubble is Jamal Murray, who helped lead the Nuggets to the conference finals for the first time since 2009, becoming an absolute scoring machine in the process. People look at some of the numbers he put up during this run and automatically assume it was because of the bubble, but a closer look proves otherwise. Most of Jamal Murray's brilliance came during a 3-game stretch against the Jazz, where he scored 50, 42, and 50 in back-to-back-to-back performances. While it was indeed an absurd stretch he went on, we have to remember who he did it against. The Utah Jazz perimeter defense has been flat out horrible for years. With guys like Donovan Mitchell, Jordan Clarkson, and old Mike Conley, and Joe Ingles as the ones checking him, Murray simply made the most of his opportunity. We literally just saw Jalen Brunson average 27 against them in this past season's playoff series, so Murray averaging 31 really isn't too outlandish when you think about it. And just like TJ Warren, Jamal Murray regressed to the mean after his first round outburst, averaging 23 points per game throughout the rest of the playoffs. Now, I'm sure there are some other arguments that people like to make about the bubble being illegitimate, but these are the 2 most frequent ones that I see online. So if you're a bubble hater and have another reason why you don't think it counts, let me know in the comments so we can hash it out there. Moving on to the best moments, I think there was just so much going on in the world at the time that we didn't really get to properly acknowledge just how incredible the basketball we were watching really was. Coming off a 4-month midseason layoff, I was honestly a little bit nervous to see what was going to happen once these games started back up again, but the players were more than ready and delivered some highlights and moments that should truly be unforgettable. Aside from TJ Warren, who we already mentioned, there were two main stars of the seeding games of the bubble. The first was Damian Lillard, who went absolutely ballistic to drag his Trailblazers into the playoff picture. When the season first resumed, Portland trailed the Grizzlies by 3.5 games for the final playoff spot. Lillard then led the Blazers to a 6-2 record during the seeding games, averaging 37-9 while shooting 43% from three. This performance earned him the only bubble MVP in NBA history, as he was unanimously voted as the best player during the seeding games. He was truly a man on a mission, and briefly had people questioning who the better long-range shooter was between him and Steph Curry due to the amount of 35-footers that he was consistently making. It capped off the best season of Dame's career and remained one of the greatest carry jobs we've seen in quite some time. The other stars of the seeding games were the Phoenix Suns, who used the bubble to mark their arrival as a legitimate powerhouse in the league. While our most recent memory of Phoenix was them getting put out by the Mavericks on their home court in Game 7, there's no denying they're one of the best teams in the NBA right now. But briefly before that, they were known as the team where Devin Booker was putting up empty stats and wasting his career. Up until 2020, the Suns had missed the playoffs for 9 straight seasons, and it looked like it was going to be 10 as they headed into the bubble 6 games back to the final playoff spot. Expectations were low, so low that some projected them to win as little as 1 game during their time in Disney. But seemingly out of nowhere, through the power of Eliza Jane, the Suns went on a legendary run, going a perfect 8-0 in the bubble. Along the way, Devin Booker hit a game-winning buzzer-beating fadeaway against the Clippers to keep their playoff hopes alive. He then hit this pose that set the internet on fire and had us all hopping on the Suns bandwagon. Despite doing all that they possibly could, the Suns missed out on the play-in game due to a tiebreaker and ended up missing the playoffs. But this run elevated the Suns from a young team with potential and upside to a team that was ready to compete right now. And when you ask Devin Booker about his team's success the last 2 seasons, even he says that it was this incredible bubble run that set the team's culture for the winning that was ahead of them. Looking at the playoffs, we got so many cool matchups and storylines throughout that seem to get glossed over the more time passes. For starters, we had a couple of amazing 7-game series in the first round. There was the Jazz Nuggets, where we already talked about Jamal Murray averaging 31, but Donovan Mitchell didn't only match, he surpassed him by averaging 36 points per game during the series. Game 4 was the only time in NBA history where 2 players went for 50 points in the same game, so that should tell you how good these two were during this duel. Denver climbed back from a 3-1 deficit and won a Game 7 that went down to the very last play, which is about as entertaining as it gets in terms of a first-round matchup. There was also the incredibly personal matchup between the Thunder and the Rockets. Prior to the season starting, Houston moved on from Chris Paul and traded him for Russell Westbrook, as they felt that he was showing signs of father time catching up with him. Instead, CP3 rejuvenated his career in OKC and took a team that had a 0.2 chance of reaching the playoffs to start the season all the way to the 5th seed out west. He came so close to knocking off the team that dumped him, but the Rockets escaped with a Game 7 win thanks to a brilliant defensive play by James Harden of all people. Aside from those 2 first-round classics, we also got this game winner by Luka Doncic to cap off the 43-point, 17-rebound, 13-assist triple-double. Everybody knew Luka was an amazing talent, but this showed the world that he was a generational player who rises to the occasion when his team needs him the most. The fact that he was in just his 2nd year doing this in his first playoff run was foreshadowing for what he was going to do to other teams for years to come. In the second round, we saw an all-time great collapse from the Clippers. All season long, the media was shoving the Battle of LA down our throats and guaranteed that the Lakers and Clippers were undoubtedly going to meet up in the conference finals. The Lakers did their part by putting the Rockets out in 5 games, but the Clippers, on the other hand, blew a 3-1 lead in legendary fashion. They didn't just lose 3 straight. They had a 15-point lead in the second half of Game 5 and a 19-point lead in the second half of Game 6. Paul George and Kawhi Leonard then went ice cold in Game 7, where the Nuggets took advantage and completed their 2nd straight 3-1 comeback of the playoffs. Nobody saw this coming, especially not the tons of NBA analysts in the media who picked the Clippers to come out of the West that year. Over East, the Milwaukee Bucks were heavy favorites to win the conference, but similar to LeBron's first stint in Cleveland, people weren't sure if Giannis was ready to be the best player on a championship team just yet. Those concerns came to life in the second round, where Jimmy Butler and the Heat proved to be too much for the Greek Freak, putting them out in 5 games. This left the East wide open and gave both the Celtics and Raptors a real shot to win the conference. Of course, they had to go through each other first, which resulted in one of the greatest playoff series of all time. After being on the brink of going down 3-0, OG Anunoby hit a miracle buzzer-beating 3 to keep Toronto in the series. They ended up exchanging the next 2 games, which meant Boston was up 3-2 and looking to close out the series in 6. We then got a double overtime bloodbath that got so intense, Nick Nurse even got directly involved, confusing Jason Tatum in the corner to throw a costly turnover down the stretch. Toronto ended up winning to tie the series, but the Celtics Celtics ultimately gutted out a Game 7 win thanks in large part to a very underrated block from Marcus Smart in the final minutes to save a game-tying layup. It was an all-around incredible series, one that I highly recommend checking out if you haven't. In the conference finals, we saw maybe the absolute peak of Anthony Davis. While being matched up against Nikola Jokic, AD put up 33 points per game on 53% shooting while holding the Joker to a playoff career-low 21 points per game. When Davis first arrived in LA, LeBron said that he hoped he could take a backseat and give his young co-star the keys at some point in the future. And during this series, it looked like that time was coming sooner rather than later. AD was hitting game winners, leading his team in scoring, and was so imposing on both ends of the floor that it seemed like he was becoming an MVP level player that was just about to enter his prime. Unfortunately, it was all pretty much downhill from here, as LeBron took over as option A in the finals and hasn't looked back since. But if you're looking for Anthony Davis at the peak of his powers, this is exactly where you'll find him. The Eastern Conference Finals saw a Celtics team that just wasn't quite ready for their brightest lights as they fell to Miami in 6 games. Bam Adebayo had one of the greatest blocks in playoff history at the end of Game 1, which was really a microcosm for the whole series. Boston was right there for the majority of these games, but it was Miami who continually made play after play down the stretch to ultimately get to the finals. Tyler Hero also had a massive 37 points in Game 4 to mark his arrival as a true rookie sensation. Moving on to the championship, I won't lie and say that it's one of the greatest finals of all time or anything, because it isn't. LA was already seen as the heavy favorite heading into this matchup, and then Goran Dragic left Game 1 in the second quarter with a foot injury, and was out for the majority of the rest of the series because of it. On top of that, Bam Adebayo missed 2 games himself with a neck injury, so the end result was never really in doubt at any point during the series. Despite that, we got an all-time great duel between Jimmy Butler and LeBron James in Game 5. You can tell LeBron sensed that it was time to close out this series during this game and delivered an all-time great performance, going for 40 points, 13 rebounds, and 7 assists on a ridiculous 71% from the field. But Jimmy Butler simply refused to go down without a fight, as he had a 35-point triple-double himself to go toe-to-toe with the King. After battling the entire fourth quarter, Butler hit a pair of go-ahead free throws with 16 seconds left to secure the victory for Miami. He gave this game everything he possibly could, and it's where we got the now iconic meme of him laying over gasping for air on the baseline. Mike Breen said it best: LeBron and Butler were exchanging haymakers for what seemed like the entire fourth quarter. It really was incredible seeing 2 of the biggest playoff performers of all time emptying the tank and giving everything that they had. So when we take a look back, we got iconic plays, all-time meltdowns, a few Game 7s, and a decent enough finals to cap off one of the most unique experiences in basketball history. This is probably the only time in our lives that we'll be able to say we've seen anything like this, and I for one cannot be more thankful. With all that was going on in the world at the time, it was not only incredible just to be able to watch the season unfold, but to see basketball in its purest form was something that I really think we take for granted. If you were a fan of the bubble, leave a like on this video. And once again, if you didn't for whatever reason, tell me why in the comments. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys next time.